Welcome to KU Parashala. My name is Chad A. Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to discuss with you today the history of Western philosophy. We will be examining 5 different periods, starting with ancient Greek philosophy, and specifically the period from Socrates to Aristotle. Now, obviously, there was a good deal of interesting philosophy done before Socrates, but the literature which survives from that era tends to be of an extremely fragmentary nature. Trying to restore the philosophy of a figure like Thales on the basis of just a few citations handed down by others is about as difficult as trying to reconstruct an entire species of hominid on the basis of just one tooth that has been left behind. The interesting thing is that by starting with Socrates, we have, in a certain sense, an even greater problem than that. It's not that Socrates left behind just a few fragments of writing, it's rather that he didn't write anything down at all. Socrates is in a comparable position to Jesus Christ, both of them founders of extraordinarily influential movements within Western thought, but both figures who did not actually write anything down. For that reason, much like we only have the 4 Gospels to try to reconstruct the life of Jesus Christ on the basis of other people's testimonies, we really are in the same position with Socrates. Now, most people know Socrates through the portrayal of Plato, who, of course, depicted him as a righteous thinker who was genuinely interested in seeking after the truth and was punished by the authorities for that very reason. But that is not the only story of Socrates which the people who knew him have handed down to us. In addition, we have the polar opposite portrayal of Socrates as an intellectual fraud and a buffoon who, for some reason, people follow even though he doesn't actually know anything, as we see in the ancient Greek comedy, The Clouds by Aristophanes. Finally, we have, admittedly, the least interesting of all 3 portrayals from Xenophon, and for that very reason, probably the most historically accurate, as there's a rule of thumb that if there are multiple versions of a story, the least interesting is probably the oldest. It is the natural tendency for a story to become more interesting as time goes on, adding details to it, rather than the other way around. At any rate, one thing we can be certain of with regard to Socrates is the biographical fact that he was put to death by the state for the crime of corrupting the youth. The term drinking the hemlock has come to stand as a metaphor for others who have suffered the same fate. Another thing we can be certain of is that Socrates' method of doing philosophy as somebody who did not prefer to write anything down was not to spell out entire systems of thought in formal treatises, which really is more something associated with Aristotle. It is rather to go out into the street and just talk to ordinary people about things they think they know, only to find that they don't really know them. And the way that Socrates did this was through the Socratic Olyncus, a method which continues to be taught to law students, continues to be used in the courtroom, at least in the West, particularly in the United States, examining whether people's account of given things is actually internally consistent, whether they maintain the same definition of X from the start of the discussion to the end. Socrates' questioning of ordinary people revealed that by the end, they either have to admit that they don't really know the thing that they claim to know about, or that they'd have to affirm both the thesis and the antithesis simultaneously. This is something which Socrates showed even in the courtroom when he was put to death, in that one of his accusers was claiming at the same time that Socrates was an atheist who was persuading people not to believe in any gods, and also that he was leading the youth to worship strange gods other than the ones that had been approved by the state. Socrates' accusal of being both an atheist and worshiping strange gods obviously reveals a certain contradiction that only betrays that the person accusing him doesn't really know who Socrates is. Socrates' high standard of maintaining logical consistency was something he extended even to the greatest thought of the ancient Greek world, in that he revealed even the poetry of Homer itself to be something that falls short of this very high standard of rigorous thinking. In one memorable dialogue handed down to us from Plato, Socrates revealed that even the most famous reciter of Homer really didn't know anything about war, despite getting all of the words about it within the poem right. And for this very reason, even the poet himself really did not know about this topic, but only channeled a force which was literally inspired by a muse, as you find at the very beginning of the Iliad and the Odyssey. For this very reason, Socrates basically argued that you can only really do thinking if you engage in this sort of Socratic dialogue, and it was for that very reason that he had been put to death by the state for breaking people out of that comfort zone of not really thinking. Socrates warned at his trial, though, that even if he dies, somebody else will indeed take his place and will keep philosophy going. And that person turned out to be, of course, Plato, Socrates' most famous student and the founder of the Academy. Plato went a bit further, perhaps, than Socrates by portraying Socrates himself as accepting his death precisely because he believed that it would help him do philosophy better. Socrates is portrayed in his final moments of arguing that between the mind and the body, it's obvious which one of the two stands more in the way of getting wisdom. It's obvious between the mind and the body which one is more prone to distractions from the five senses, which one has more irrational desires which lead it off course of seeking wisdom, which one of them has more basic survival needs which an enormous amount of time must be devoted to satisfying, especially in the ancient Greek world in which modern technology and fossil fuels were not available. It took some 3 hours of labor every day just to grind enough grain to be able to make bread the following day. Under this view, leaving behind the body in order to simply become a purified mind through the disembodied soul was actually kind of a good thing. He also argued that between the mind and the body, it's obvious which of the two is simply better at understanding. Seeing something with your eyes really just gives you access to a bundle of colors and other sensations. You only really understand something if you can contemplate the purified notion of it with the mind. Yet this begs the question how such pure contemplation could be possible unless the soul had, in a certain sense, already learned these things before it entered this body, in which case it really saw the purified notion in an immaterial realm, which Plato called the world of ideas. In Plato's dialogue The Meno, he argued that most of what we think is learning new information is actually just remembering things that we didn't know that we know. He proved this by taking an illiterate slave boy, the least likely of all people to know anything about mathematics, and showing that even this person could solve a basic math problem if he was just given a little help to bring about that process of his own recollection. For this reason, Socrates, or rather Plato's Socrates, is portrayed in this dialogue as going as far as extending this beyond the realm of just mathematical knowledge. It's not just truths about circles, squares, or numbers that this sort of purified knowledge of recollection is at work. It's rather the physical objects we see with the five senses as well. You understand what a horse is when you see it only because you saw the purified notion of a horse in the world of ideas. And that, of course, occurred when you were just a soul without a body. In the Republic, Plato proposed the allegory of the cave in order to illustrate how truth really is manifest within not just a dualism between this world and the world of ideas, but rather a whole hierarchy of intermediary stages. In the story, a group of people who had spent their entire lives chained against a wall inside a cave, watching the shadows cast by puppets in front of a fire which was behind their back that they could not see, those people would obviously think that shadows are the only thing that exist. If they were freed from those chains, they would conclude that it's puppets that really exist. If they escaped the cave, they would conclude, at first, looking into a pool of water, that reflections of things exist. But when they finally saw the things themselves, horses, men, etc., walking around, the deeper point would be that even those were just representations. They would have to go even further to the world of ideas to see the notion. And finally, even beyond that, to the sun, the metaphor of the good in itself. Aristotle, of course, differed from both Plato and Socrates by favoring the path not so much of questioning others to show that they didn't really know anything, but rather to simply rise up to the challenge of actually knowing. And the way that Socrates did this was by writing the kind of lengthy, systematic treatises that give definite answers instead of many questions, which we take for granted today to be the standard way to do philosophy, but can only really be understood in that properly Platonic and Socratic context. For example, Aristotle differed from Plato's account of the soul by arguing that the idea of a spirit which temporarily inhabits one's body and then leaves after one dies to inhabit the world of ideas mistakes the soul for a thing which is individualized, one for each person, and is immaterial. But in reality, the soul simply is a collection of formal abilities which can be factored out of so many material and natural life forms. For example, just as the numbers 4 and 5 can be factored out of the number 20, and in a certain sense the number 20 simply is the product of 4 and 5, you can factor certain abilities out of given life forms. For example, a coconut tree has the abilities for nutrition, it can feed, and it has the ability for growth. It's not unique, though, to the coconut tree, as a banana plant will have the same abilities for nutrition and growth, and really any other plant simply could be considered to be the product of those two factors. Interestingly, higher life forms, so-called, at least as Aristotle understood it in his day, such as animals, have those abilities too. An animal, like a bird, is able to feed, it's able to grow through its various stages of its life process, but it has some other abilities as well. It is able to move around in a way that a coconut tree cannot. It is able to have sense perception. It can see with the eyes, it can hear with the ears, it can feel with its body in a way that the coconut tree, at least according to Aristotle, could not. Therefore, an animal simply is the product of these factors, two of which are lacking from the lower plants. Humans, in contrast, have all of those lower abilities, but also have the mysterious ability of logos, a term from Greek which is difficult to translate in that it could mean reason, or it could also mean language, and Aristotle seemed to place a greater emphasis on the latter, is the ability for man as the animal who can speak to be capable of things like ethical action, political action, which animals, for all of their amazing abilities given by nature, simply are not capable of. Likewise, each entity really does not have its own soul, which temporarily inhabits its body and then leaves for the world of ideas, as Plato argued and the Christian tradition itself was largely influenced by. Rather, there is only one soul in the sense that there is only one collection of abilities, ordered hierarchically from these lower ones present in plants to the highest ones present in humans, just as there is only one set of numbers. Any given arithmetical operation might use them, but the numbers had to have pre-existed any instantiation in such operations as something of a purely formal system. This is almost like Saussure's distinction between langue and parole. Parole is what actually comes out of someone's mouth, but they can only speak such word if language, or rather langue, existed already as a purely formal system of relations. Aristotle therefore went on to define happiness very precisely as I quote him, an activity of the soul implying a rational principle, in other words accessible only to humans, in accord with virtue. Likewise, he argued very controversially that animals and children really are not happy precisely because they lack reason. Aristotle proved this in the Nicomachean Ethics by showing that all acts have a certain teleological orientation towards some good, but not all goods are created equal. For example, people pursue money simply because they see it as a means to an end to achieve happiness, even though the connection between the two is rarely quite as simple as that. This reason, Aristotle argued that there are really three different kinds of lives which a human being could live. And the word bios, which he used to explain this, was, ironically enough, not the transliteration of a biological life force, which we might assume he meant, even though that is quite literally the same word taken from Greek into English. That really is more like the Greek word zoe, which we get words like zoology, the study of this lower life force present in all animals, or words like protozoa, kind of a primitive sort of life, a first form of life. For Aristotle, rather, bios is more like the term biography. It's an account of life or a story of life. And the motivation you had in your action is certainly going to be a big part of that story. He argued that the most common story of such a life would be the life of pleasure. This is the vulgar life in the literal sense of the life that is accessible to the masses, just as vulgar Latin was not a tongue of Latin that was particularly crude, as you might think. It was rather the common dialect of Latin, which was to be heard spoken even in the furthest provinces of the Roman Empire. And in much the same way, the life of pleasure really is just the standard type of life in which you're seeking out good feelings for yourself. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it is lower than the life of political engagement. This is the life of honor, in which one seeks out the good of the community over one's own personal private pleasures. This reason is accessible to a much smaller minority of humans. Higher still, though, is the life of contemplation. This is the life of the philosopher, in which the highest kind of happiness comes from contemplation of truth. This is also the highest kind of happiness because thinking eternal truth really does not depend on any external factors, as the first two lives would. Having pleasurable experiences of food, for example, requires that food to really exist. It requires the farmers who produced it to have had a successful harvest. The pleasure of political engagement for the community is also dependent upon external factors because, as anyone who has tried to make a change on a political level knows, you have to have a lot of help to get that done. But in contemplating truth, you are freed from such conditions to have the highest life, and this is why this is the life accessible to the fewest, and also the reason why Aristotle argued that those who lack reason lack access to the very possibility of this kind of happiness. Aristotle argued in addition that happiness is achieved through virtue, but we must bear in mind that Aristotle's ethics, it really is not morality in the, say, medieval or modern Christian sense, although it's not totally unrelated to it either. Rather, just as a knife has certain virtues which determine that it is satisfied the criteria of being what a knife is supposed to be. For example, a good knife is sharp enough, it is safe to use, it is easy to handle, it fits comfortably in your hand. A knife that had failed in one of those really could not even be considered a knife. Human beings also have 12 virtues which differentiate them as having satisfied the criteria of being human, and also avoid the 24 corresponding vices, which would indicate some sort of failure. Now, it might seem interesting initially that there are 24 vices and only 12 virtues, but Aristotle understood this in the precise sense that a virtue simply is the mean between two extremes. For example, being so cowardly that you're completely unwilling to take any risks is a vice, because that is not what a good person would do. On the other hand, being so reckless that you put yourself, others in danger, etc., that's also a vice, because that is not what a good person is supposed to do, who of course would be somewhere in the middle of those two. He argued for this very reason that ethics really is the study of habit in the literal sense, that the Greek word ethos simply is the word for habit, and therefore you can't learn to be ethical just through thinking about it in the abstract. This is a kind of practical knowledge which you can only have through practice, that is to say, through actually living the ethical life itself. This reason, Aristotle counted ethics alongside politics as the practical sciences, be contrasted with the purely theoretical sciences like, say, mathematics, metaphysics, physics. These are things which you can understand simply in the abstract. For the practical sciences, ethics is the means of achieving the good on an individual level, while politics is the means of achieving the good on a collective level. Finally, Aristotle argued that such practical embodiment of ethical knowledge must be achieved through action, because the virtues are quite literally not natural. That is to say, among the abilities which humans have simply by nature, for example, you don't have to work on being able to feel raw sensations such as heat, cold, pain, pleasure, because it's already a part of your hardwired nature to be able to feel those things. You do have to work on becoming ethical, because the 12 virtues are supplementary abilities which literally go beyond one's innate human nature and are therefore only ever obtained by a small ethical minority. Those, of course, once again, who have access to reason. So we will conclude the lecture on ancient Greek philosophy now, and I thank you once again for the opportunity to have this discussion with you.